bom dia. It's an honor to be with our distinguished panelists and to interact with you all today. I think I would agree with Zena and with Fabio that we're in a historic moment here with the country, and all eyes are on Brazil, certainly. From an asset allocation perspective, of course, because in a world of etiolated growth in advanced economies, Brazil still has this promise, still with a younger median age than a lot of the advanced economies in which people are allocating to, whether that's in real assets or whether that's in fixed income or whether that's in the equity markets. So I think just to think in three parts, in the macroeconomic environment, the external world in which we're operating today, I think we are facing something which predated the global financial crisis of 2008, and that is that we are in a dearth of demand. And we as advanced economies have not been able to cope with the changing patterns of demand, namely that from moving from old economic growth to major industrial manufacturing growth, the second industrial revolution, to new economic growth. So really predominantly moving from goods producing to services providing economies. Wage growth hasn't kept up with that. We haven't figured out how to measure productivity. We haven't figured out how to invest in productivity. So in this phenomena that predated the crisis, we then had the global financial crisis, and in response to that, policymakers have induced very strong medicine. And as the late Hyman Minsky would tell us, strong medicine often has strong side effects. And the strong side effects of a decade of low to negative interest rates, of course, is piling on leverage. So where we are in the business cycle, if we even step back from the kind of late cycle territory which we're in and come into the structural deficiencies in some of the world's largest economies like the United States, we are facing a crisis of debt. And of course, we've seen all of the headlines over the last week on the leveraged loan situation here in the United States, $14.8 trillion sitting on corporate balance sheets in America. We have Janet Yellen talking about the deterioration of credit quality in the United States. And of course, we've seen a lot of investors pile into a lot of these leveraged loans in the hunt for yield. Where I'm particularly concerned is looking at the percentage of those loans which are held by passive funds, which in America, 16% of that debt is owned by passive funds, which means, of course, it's prey to redemption risk in a herding sentiment moment, which, of course, in our asset bubble kind of years since 1966, we're very prone to do. So we have this leverage, and then we have also this phenomena of strong medicine, which is the greatest experiment in monetary policy that we've had in economic history. And so we face these years of the great unwind, quote unquote. But is it the great unwind? I know that Lisa's former colleague would say that it's, this Quexit is going to be much slower than anticipated. We're seeing that in the United States as well, where we're seeing futures markets price in the Fed would have less of a rapid rate rise environment that some investors would like. We're seeing that with the ECB today, gloomy data coming out, also giving the ECB pause on its rapid unwind from its quantitative easing and balance sheet reduction. So we have these experiments, but actually if we look back historically, Brazil has weathered the last financial crisis actually relatively well. If you look at GDP growth coming out of 2009, I happened to be in Brazil at the time. It was extraordinary, heady times, 2009 to 2011 really, and 2012. So it weathered the last crisis relatively well. If we look at economic policy on the macro side, I would agree again with the previous speakers that the Temer administration and Meirelles and Goldfein really implemented what the Bank for International Settlements would define as macroprudential measures. So maintaining the tripe, so inflation targeting, exchange rate, floating exchange rate, and fiscal spending reduction, maintaining this tripe or tripod policy is actually the poster child of macroprudential measures. So I think I would agree with the consensus again that this is more of the same. With Campos Neto now in the central bank, I think it's also more of the same in a safe pair of hands, moving in March. And I think the reform agenda hopefully will certainly stay. But the geopolitical implications of this dearth in demand are some that I have concern on with the current administration in Brazil and its ability to translate this to its voting publics. So that is that while we have rockstar central bankers implementing this whole monetary experiment, at the political level, we have a lot of people feeling disenfranchised, that their sovereignty and their policy and their creation of wealth is not in their own hands, and that it's in the hands of a bunch of people at Davos, or it's in the hands of a bunch of people at Jackson Hole. And so I think this kind of response to, or suspicions of globalism, certainly helped Bolsonaro win, I think, very clearly. I'm seeing it pop up as a worrisome trend around the world. We need only look to what just happened with the central bank in India, where we're having politicians and policymakers and economists have to make decisions in response to global changes in patterns of demand or price or interest rates, and then being held suspect back at home. So the potential loss of a central banking independence is something that's very pregnant and real. I would say that we've had conflicting, and again to echo Paulo, I would say we've had conflicting messages coming out of the Bolsonaro team since the election and then since his inauguration on globalism. The one positive trend that I see in the rejigging of the ministries, and I won't take from Chris too much, but in the creation of the super ministry of the economy, where planning has come together with trade. Trade has been moved out of the foreign ministry, so there is actually a potential, I think, for greater openness to trade. But again, what's very important is how Bolsonaro translates this to the voting public. Because to be able to be open to trade is to be able to be open to FDI, and these are the kinds of things that Lisa and her colleagues look for, and then what some of our clients look for in terms of pension funds after that. So that openness and how it's translated will become very pertinent. And again, it's not just Bolsonaro, it's not just Brazil. I'm seeing it happen in France. I'm seeing this happen in Italy. This is the real inflection point, I think, of our generation. What's also interesting at the geopolitical level is, again, how changes in macroeconomic policy will be translated to publics who may or may not be familiar with the terms. Or with the long-term benefits. I look by some of these estimations that if the pension, any kind of diluted pension fund reform comes through, that will take 10 to 20 years possibly to implement, which Fabio was highlighting some of the dimensions. So how do you translate that? How do you translate to a public long accustomed to a Bolsa Familia that worked in the commodity super cycle? Again, a different type of demand. But now with cash-strapped governments, we don't have the surplus to be able to absorb any increase in diesel prices. And of course, we saw what happened over the summer when the Temer administration tried to increase diesel prices, shaving 0.4% off of Brazilian GDP growth. Thank you so much. So I would say, as we look out, longer term, this is in the hands of Bolsonaro. While we have the extraordinary technocratic reform happening and being inherited from the Temer team, what I would see is also how is this president going to try and generate growth in the real economy? So here we are in New York, we're like in sexy Madison Avenue talking about financial services and private equity and pension funds and rating agencies, but really it comes down to generating job growth and reducing unemployment. So unemployment has come down in recent quarters, but it's still, if you look at it pre-2016, it's still very worrisome. I think, again, this is one of the reasons why security, it goes hand in hand with security and the homicide rate in Brazil. So how are we creating jobs? How does inbound FDI generate jobs? I don't see many politicians actually translating that today. How are potential mergers generating jobs? And I won't name names, but of course we've seen one Brazilian legacy manufacturer where there's a lot of job creation under the radar, and Bolsonaro has maintained that these jobs will be kept in Brazil. So I think that, and I think we can turn to this in a bit, but I also think, how are we generating job growth in a new economy? And Brazil, I think, has some also promises of hope. So I'll stop there.